Welcome, everybody. Welcome to our final session of our social inclusion webinar series, where we aim to highlight the key topics and research that shaped our social inclusion journal over the past year. Today, we tackle the issue Accomplices to Social Exclusion, analyzing institutional processes of silencing. And for that, we have today joining us a very special panel who will help us dive into this thematic issue. Before we kick things off, I'd just like to say a few things. First of all, this webinar is made up of four 15-minute presentations by our speakers, followed by an open Q&A slot. Please leave your questions in the dedicated Q&A chat box, as it makes it easier for us to organize each question, to not confuse you for the general chat. And also, please don't forget to address which speaker you are directing your question to, if that is the case. This webinar is being recorded, as are the other two webinars hosted this month in the series, which are already available on YouTube if you want to check them out as well. And this one will be too, just in a few days after this session. I'll end this introduction by saying that all the articles presented today, as well as the entire thematic issue and all of the remaining research, are available for your reading pleasure in full open access in the social inclusion website at cogitatiopress.com. I will be linking each article as the speakers tackle them. And that's it. So without further ado, I'll introduce our first speaker, Dr. Ulrike VIeten, Associate Professor in Sociology and Transnational Sociologist based at Queen's University Belfast in Northern Ireland. As a feminist interested in intersectionality, she takes inspiration from political activism of Black and minority scholars across the globe and has recently published on gender and far-right populism. And Ulrike is also academic editor of the special issue, and she will introduce us and contextualize us a little bit about the research that we're about to hear and also the overarching scope of the thematic issue. So Ulrike, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Welcome all, and kind thanks to José, Batista, and the Open Access Journal Social Inclusion for initiating and organizing this webinar, as you already said. This open access journals really are democratizing, I feel, academic knowledge, because the word is open access. So to those who haven't had the chance to read our special issue, perhaps might be more even inclined to do this after the webinar, it's a great opportunity to learn about different topics, or it's spanning actually different topics across the everything that has to do with social inclusion, obviously. So my name, already introduced, is Ulrike VIeten. I'm specialized, I'm in sociology, but I'm also specialized in the sociology of gender, migration, and racism. So working actually on the construction of racialized, or what I call racialized boundaries in historical perspectives for more than 20 years. I'm mentioning here particularly my co-editor, Dr. Emily Mitchell-Barczyk, Arden University, who unfortunately can't be here today, but she shared with me her thoughts, providing some insights how the theme of this special issue actually emerged. In fact, the concept of silencing and unsilencing is Emily's intellectual contribution to the field. Her interest in silencing actually developed during her doctoral studies on socially saturated and embedded processes of silencing and its impact on conflict-related sexual violence survivors in the post-Yugoslav Balkans. And it was this work actually through this work, that she engaged more in depth with the distinction between silence as a mobilization of self-selected rebellion and protection, and silencing as a series of social impositions on survivors in their post-conflict lives. It also became apparent that giving voice to lived experiences presents a naturally antithetical to survivors often seek to mobilize to move past their lived experiences. Me, myself, and that's why I'm pronouncing this particular, that the topic of silencing actually came into this kind of opportunity space through Emily's contribution through her PhD. Myself, rather working in different ways on processes of normalization. I mentioned already my focus on racialized group boundaries, but for those interested, almost 10 years ago by now, in 2014, I also edited a book which looked at actually specifically Iris Marion Young's writing on inclusion, democracy, and normalization. So the topic of normalization, or what does it bring to these, let's say, interrogation of what silencing can do in institutional environments, means that on the one hand, we might be in a situation where we face up or have to face up to individual people who actively try to silence us. Okay, if I generalize this. But quite often it's more something that the institutional structure is operating in a very normalized way. Then it becomes, on the one hand, rather abstract and more difficult to grasp or to tackle the phenomenon that we are silenced, particularly people from minority background are silenced, because these normalized processes do not even, or are not helping to uncover the silencing itself. So the cooperation in that sense was really productive and fruitful with Emily. And as we wrote in our introduction to this special issue, and I quote, framing silencing as a mobilization of power, especially by institutions that seek to uphold and bolster that power, is a bold claim to make. But this leads to questions of why institutions mobilize silencing for a shelter for power that has tangible qualities visible to the outside world. And here also referring to Brown and unquote. So following our call of 4 papers, so I tried to basically introduce what brought me and what brought Emily to this topic. So following our call for papers, we received really a wide range of excellent papers which fitted the overall topic or the topical scope. Papers we published are spanning a range of countries, though there's, I'd say, a focus on Europe at large. But it's not only focusing on different or range of countries, but also on different problematics. For example, Gauci and Abraham's paper on compulsory social measures in Switzerland, discussing the hundreds of thousands of children and adolescents from backgrounds of poverty, from the minority Yenish population. I'm not quite sure who is familiar with this minority, the Yenish, who were placed in foster families or mobilized as farm laborers. This is just an example. And we have heard, or we know that let's say, the Aborigines, for example, in Australia, first generation kids have been taken from homes and families. So it's also touching the problem of racialized boundaries in some ways, but also in different countries and for different reasons, this attempt, again, by institutions, either to silence specific groups, but also to silence the deeds, silence historical deeds. And it's very difficult then, of course, to tackle these problematics. We also had papers dealing with institutional processes of silencing, so normative ableism. As far as I remember, there were 2 papers explicitly dealing with these conflicts, where ableism in institutions basically then is taking power from minorities or disabled people. Or another example, exploring the agency of unaccompanied refugees in the Netherlands. And here I wanted to phrase this, as I started in the beginning, the distinction between silencing and unsilencing. So on one hand, perhaps unpacking structures of the past where silencing took place, but also more let's say, on the positive side, thinking about how in institutions, if you take this seriously, if you take responsibility, how you can also unsilence voices. So this is just a taster, let's say, of the papers. So I would, everyone interested in the theme, encouraged to have a look. What I found interesting, again, we were surprised when we uttered the call to see also the breadth of topical contributions on the role of institutions and their complicity in acts of normalization of silencing. Our contributors, and I think that's inclusive or is covering all of them, make powerful arguments around the social structures that often influence our ability to vocalize and thus confront injustices. So it's also about and tackling, not going into this really here, what the role of bystanders is and could be, and how we also could then unpack these institutional structures. And I think in 2025, with ongoing wars and the mushrooming of totalitarian, in brackets, fascist leaders and far-right parties, the theme of institutional silencing, also as an everyday occurrence, had not lost its currency, quite the opposite. And on the background of international war and just dropping this here, outrage on the war in Gaza, particularly in some countries, the silencing of critical voices mean that institutional processes of silencing are related to hegemonic claims, and that has become very pronounced. The truth, who is telling the truth, and who is basically able and willing to confront different views and engaging in a dialogue, actually. If we silence critiques, if we silence people, we don't have any chance to develop critical view. And then it means, in effect, that what I said earlier, there is a tendency to authoritarian understandings that might even be established before the actual authoritarian rule is in place, if you know what I mean. So, okay, just to end, we hope today's webinar will equip, at least to some degree, attendants with the knowledge to think about how institutional processes of silencing affect their everyday lives, and also the drive to both unravel and confront them. And I hand over to José Batista, who will introduce the other speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ulrike, for this contextualization, always also for helping putting the issue together. We'll move on to our first presentation of the day. I'll introduce Ana Maria Isola. She holds a PhD in social policy. She's also currently the research director at the University of Eastern Finland and also works as a chief researcher at the Finnish Institute for Health and Welfare, where she leads research on social inclusion. I will now ask her to come to the virtual stage and share her presentation as well. Well, she will talk to us about her paper, Intergenerational Social Exclusion, Silences and the Transformation of Agency, an Oral History Approach. We can see your presentation as well. Seems that everything is fine, so the floor is yours.
Thank you. Greetings from a coldish spring in Helsinki. I'm going to tell you about my article on intergenerational social exclusion, silences, and the transformation of agency. The driver for doing this research was the Finnish discussion on the intergenerational transmission of disadvantages and the concern about the growing number of disadvantaged people in Finland. And after following the discussion for a few years, I wanted to examine it. So through the snowball method and during the fieldwork, I collected small stories about people's family stories to study this phenomenon. 13 study participants shared their family stories that shed light on transgenerationally transmitted disadvantage, including substance abuse, trauma, violence, emotional coldness, neuropsychiatric traits and mental health issues. I chose oral history as a method to examine these small stories told by the study participants. The oral history knowledge is constructivist and it's always open to interpretation. This is why I took people who shared their family stories as my collaborative partners who discussed possible interpretations with me. However, it was I who interpreted findings through the lens of social inclusion, exclusion, silence, power dynamics, and agency. Silence in this context can be both protective and destructive, shaping the ability of marginalized groups to participate in society. Then experiences of social inclusion, they are characterized by feelings of non-belonging, meaninglessness, sense of being different, and being unable to manage life due to unequal opportunities. And agency is conceptualized as the ability to act persuasively on behalf of a common project with the capacity to influence and change the world. What I said might sound rather abstract, so I concretize my study with the family stories of 3 study participants. And these stories illustrate the reasons and agents behind the silences I found. They also hint at why silences may accumulate disadvantage in the chain of generations. I identified 3 types of family stories. First, stories of exclusion and inclusion. Second, stories of occlusion. And by occlusion, I refer to the process whereby family stories blur out and get lost. And it occurs when family members can no longer retrieve episodes or figures from the family's collective memory. In such cases, the following generations are left without material they could use to understand themselves and see opportunities in their lives. And the third type of the stories was stories of agency modifications, where participants reflect on changes in their ability to act within society. The first finding I picked up here is that the community enables silence that protects the individual. And here I introduce Coral to you. She comes from a family with neuropsychiatric features, alcoholism, and trauma. Coral supposes that her grandparents had tried to solve some of their problems by joining a revival movement with a Finnish community, very conservative, faith-based community that is loving to its members. So. And by joining this community, the ancestors may have left the package of unresolved issues as a social legacy to their descendants, including Coral. And this is how she describes her thoughts. I guess it's been a bit like that. If you think that the religious community has welcomed a broken person with open hearts and love, God has accepted them the way that they are. There was no need to analyze your problems. You could simply leave them behind. But then, boom, 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 the problems were passed on to the generations that followed, and maybe they even became more difficult in some sense. Based on Coral's story, I interpreted that the faith-based community may have been a source of power for Coral's grandparents, providing recognition and a sense of belonging. But while the community outside had looked down on them. Secondly, silence protects the family against discrimination. A religious community probably safeguarded Coral's grandparents from discrimination. But what if the family doesn't have a protective community, but rather a community that discriminates? Dove's story illustrates this. Dove is a middle-aged person who has suffered mental health issues almost their whole life. And in their whole family history, there have been exceptionally many family members who have died of cancer. Then, by chance, Dove heard that they were suicides, actually. At that moment, Dove realized that there was an underlying disease in her family that they couldn't do anything about. Still, Dove wondered why the family story was so one-tracked with only one truth. And it also included forbidden topics. They felt that the ancestors used power beyond the grave, as they said, by allowing only one story, and this way controlled their understanding of the family. Dove wanted to tell her own story and take back the agency. During Dove's project, they came across a documentary about the history on the mental hospitals of the 19th century Finland. And from the documentary, then Dove got the insight, which they explain as follows. People protect themselves. I'm sure that someone in their family has also been protected by simply tolerating the difficult issues. I just watched a documentary about the island of Saili. It's a mental hospital, Finnish mental hospital. Women who reacted to something were taken to Saili. It's not all that far from the current world. Even the researcher in the documentary was teary-eyed because people had been taken to Saili for the rest of their lives through no fault of their own. They had been, in a way, defined as mentally ill because they had reacted to something. In Dove's story, the historical compassion demonstrated by the researcher played an essential role, as it convinced Dove that some of their family members had been treated unfairly. And it helped Dove to understand that white lies told in their family served like like a shield against discrimination. And they continues. I've thought in a way that this peculiar defense mechanism in the generations before me have worked for them, but for generations after them, it has only caused harm through that closure, denial, and it's unfair. I don't know how it could have gone differently, but in a way, what worked for them doesn't work for us anymore. In this respect, Dove's narration comes close to what previous studies on indigenous people have shown. Silence protects, yet it may deepen the experiences of social exclusion of the descendants. I've got a hunch what Dove meant, but it was half a year later when I realized what they was after. I was sitting at the archive desk with Breeze, one study participant, browsing through patient diaries from mental hospitals, when I came across a random entry in the column for mental illnesses running in the family. It was as follows. The parents are cousins to each other. The mother suffered from gloom in her youth. The father's father was a strange drunkard. An aunt from the father's side drank spirits, then hung herself, and it was written 1911. We wandered that text together with Breeze, and finally it assisted me to understand why Dove's family may have kept quiet about mental health issues and fabricated white lies stories about relatives who died of cancer. They protected the family against discrimination, I thought, in the era of the fear of social degeneration. This idea derives from the economic structures in the late 19th century, including assimilation policies, racial hygiene, and cis-normative order, and it excluded ethnic, gender, and disability minorities, even from human rights in Finland. The doctrine of social degeneration posits that mental degeneration worsens over 4 generations and ultimately lead to the extinction of family brands. But now it's Breeze's turn to step into the picture. She is also a middle-aged woman with 7 children. Her great-grandfather had been registered as a vagrant, a person without a permanent home in the late 19th century. Being a vagrant was forbidden in Finland back in the day. Breeze believed that her great-grandfather, her grandmother, and her father also had neuropsychiatric characteristics, and she would like to have confirmation about it, but it was impossible as her family story on her father's side consisted of only bits and pieces and was occluded. And that is why we search for pieces of evidence for her assumption from archives without succeeding. But basically, Breeze was puzzled over the silence around neuropsychiatric characteristics and the congenital nature in public discussions. She said, there is still not enough discussion about the intergenerational inheritance of neuropsychiatric characteristics. For me, it would be important to know that these features are passed on in the family, that they don't appear out of nowhere. And now it's time for conclusions. First, in the late 19th century, fears of social degeneration resulted in discrimination, which families attempted to protect against by remaining silent about issues that deviated from the assumed norm. In previous generations, silence was often the only way to exercise power. As a result, in these cases, in my study, family stories had been occluded, and it had led to increased difficulties because people couldn't find the source of the problems and take appropriate action. Second, the fear of social degeneration has led to new silences in today's society. Even when a trait is congenital, there has been a reluctance in the social sciences to discuss it as such, primarily aimed at protecting individuals from discrimination, I suppose. However, this avoidance has left people with congenital traits without crucial information that could help them improve their well-being and that of their families. Such paternalist protection can create additional challenges across generations. And last but not least, today people have more and more opportunities to share their stories. And when sharing their stories, people break silences. Narratives can become powerful instruments for social change, enabling people to reshape their agency and reclaim their power. By building circumstances where people can identify the silence in their lives, we increase the chances of addressing and resolving the challenges accumulated over time. That was that. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna Maria, for sharing your research and also those very touching testaments as well that were part of your paper. Let's move on now to Faime Alpagu. She's a postdoctoral researcher at Columbia University's Department of Germanic Languages and holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Vienna. Her research examines the intersections of migration and refugee studies, audiovisual studies, archive studies, biographical research, memory, and practices of inclusion and exclusion in academia. Today, she graces this webinar with her article Diversity in White, an autoethnographic case study of experience, diversity, and unsilencing. So, Faime, whenever you're ready, we're all ears.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. Yeah, and thank you very much all for being here. You can hear me and see the slides, I guess. Yeah. Yeah, I will talk about how my research was hijacked and how I was unsilenced and how publication can be a way of unsilencing these practices. To start with, I want to clarify a short theoretical framing. When I talk about whiteness, I do not just talk about skin color in a narrow sense. I mean whiteness the way James Baldwin describes it. White is a metaphor for power. Whiteness means holding power and acting in line with power. Decision-making bodies remain dominated by white middle-class individuals with little experience of structural discrimination or racism and limited understanding of intersectional inequalities. People of color may also align with those in power. I saw them. All names in the paper are anonymized. There are reasons for that. One is the ethical issue. The other thing is, at the time of writing, she was threatening me to withdraw my complaint. backed by various institutions. A performance she continues to do. Her partner is the deputy director of the institution she was working. The director is a longtime friend, and she has support from white migration researchers. Looking back, I would not hesitate to name them or these institutions. But my point is, this was not an isolated incident. It reflects a systematic exclusion. As Lorgia Garcia Pena notes about her losing her tenure, she says, "My experience, while singular, is not unique. And to be honest, the names does not matter, but the actions do." Remaining silent was not an option for me, even if speaking up was still and is still painful. But I feel responsible for myself, but also for the future generation. There were people who could have stood up against this unfairness. Isola VIeten and her colleagues called them drawbridges. People who were involved, acknowledged wrongdoing, but refused to provide formal support. Instead, they told me I should focus on publishing my dissertation specifically. But none of them offered me any real support how to do that, just to advise, "You should publish." And I followed their advice. But I published, but not the dissertation they had in mind. I published this paper. But finally, I also could publish something on the material in question, audio letters from my dissertation. Here are some short slides about the methods. I will not talk about it due to time issues. My complete biography, to speak with Sarah Ahmed, begins with what seemed like an opportunity. I participated in a career development mentoring program for women researchers. As a Kurdish woman from a displaced family, I was and am the only woman to work at the university. I was hopeful. I was fairly young, not a native speaker of the working language, and in retrospect, very naive. I believed that those in such programs would be collegial, ethical, and anti-racist. But soon I was confronted with the reality of paternalistic and unethical practices, particularly from a fellow participant who I call the migration researcher, MR. She approached me for a collaborative project. She had worked in an archival institution. I was working with family archive materials of so-called guest workers from Turkey. This was one of these materials that was not worked before, except for an oral history project by Alistair Thompson. I had planned to focus on audio letters in my postdoc. This seemed like a meaningful collaboration, which turned out to be a nightmare. At one point, she told me that my contribution was only about guest workers anyway, and I should take my guest workers, adding that while she could do that herself, but she would leave it to me. I found this deeply racist and discriminatory, as it reduced my expertise to a singular topic, guest workers, simply because I am also from Turkey. The same did not apply to her. As a white researcher from the global north, she could study guest workers without knowledge of their country, the language, the methods, any prior knowledge on migration studies, as she still does. Anyway, it was clear to me I cannot work with her. I withdrew from the collaboration, which was also a huge challenge because she wouldn't take a no as an answer. And I emphasized in person via email that this proposal cannot be used. And I also, especially the part about my research expertise, I also informed the funding body about my withdrawal. After I withdrew from the collaboration, thinking the issue was resolved, MR brought the conflict to the next mentoring group, demanding it to be publicly addressed. I explained to my group colleagues that I could not handle the emotional burden of a confrontation anymore, and that I had said everything I needed to say. Still, the group insisted, framing my experience of discrimination as a threat to the cohesion of the group. MR positioned herself as a victim, claiming the group wouldn't be safe unless one of us left. Under pressure, I reached out to the program coordinator. She told me that she could not help me because the program was officially over, and she added in a follow-up email, the subject of your call exists my responsibility and also my competences. The bold part, the subject of my call was racism and discrimination that I told her on the phone, which was the background of the conflict. She could not name it via email. In effect, I was left without any support. Looking back, I see how I was portrayed as the problem, as Sarah Ahmed describes, the killjoy, disturbing the group's harmony. While the organization said to me the program was over, she cannot help me, they still funded a coach to manage the situation, which only deepened my exclusion and silenced my experience through a framework of white feminism. And here comes the side note. Before the meeting, some group members had already been informed by MR, and they discussed how they can help her. She told them that I suddenly ended the collaboration, I was not doing well, and that she needed some financial support. I was easily made the person who is not stable. The group coach was also involved, as MR had booked individual session with coach who was advising the coordinator. And the funny part is nobody knew that the other person knows about that. And including me, I found it a year later. A year later, after leaving the mentoring group, because I had to leave to let the group be safe, I discovered MR had submitted a project based on the proposal without my knowledge, without my consent, with another white collaborator, a technician without a research background. I filed formal complaints supported by testimonials from our shared mentor in the program, my PhD supervisor, the proofreader of the proposal, who is a colleague and friend of mine who edited my dissertation and basically knew how deeply heavy my research is in the proposal. And a colleague from the mentoring group who later recognized how she had been instrumentalized in my exclusion. Until today, she is the only person who supported me. And through the joint efforts with her, we could reconstruct what really happened. So thank you to her. I think she is also in the audience. Institutions' responses were dismissive. The funding body deflected any responsibility. The National Misconduct Board rejected my case without review. At the time of our collaboration at the beginning, I was finalizing my dissertation and had shared all the research on topic she had never worked on. By the time I filed the complaint, the official one, I had completed my PhD and received multiple awards, including 2 from the very institution funding her project. Neither MR nor her current collaborator holds a PhD. I was reminded of James Baldwin's words, Black people must be at least 38 times better than any random white person to achieve anything. She marginalized me in my field, appropriated my work, erased my contribution, and excluded me from networks she now uses to promote herself as having pioneered in this research. Today, she is recognized for the research I initiated and attends the same conferences and networks I was part of, spaces where I now feel deeply uncomfortable. As Lorgia Garcia Pena describes, even after becoming a professor, the person who once excluded her remained comfortably in the room, while Pena felt uncomfortable and left. That is the power of white privilege. The case took place at the university that had received a national award for diversity. After discovering MR's project, I contacted the program leaders again, the very awarded unit. In meetings, they referred to my complaint as a claim and focused on protecting the university's reputation, what Sarah Ahmed calls the politics of admission, where diversity is about textual performances, not real change. In fact, they only met me because meanwhile, 2 mentors from the program had intervened. Both those meetings become another form of harm. I was asked to repeat my experience over and over without any action. This demand for objectivity from survivors is itself a form of violence, as VIeten and her colleagues argue. I also realize institutions use the demand for excessive repetition to cause another form of silencing, since complaints need to eventually take a step back to protect their mental health. That is what I did. They met me only to report officially that they heard me out. They did everything right. Eventually, one leader admitted, "You are right, but that is how the system is. We are 20 years behind when it comes to racism." Sarah Ahmed notes, admitting one's own racism does not do what it says. Politically correct language only does not make anyone anti-racist. That is what I saw. It can be deeply misleading, as it was in my case. I joined the program hoping to challenge racism and exclusion. Instead, I left with the worst experience in my academic life. I realized these programs do not foster solidarity or justice. They teach powerful people how to overpower others. In other words, they teach powerful individuals how to be better bullies, and how damaging group dynamics can be. And worse, when you complain, the system act as if we are all on equal ground. From the beginning until today, I haven't been truly heard. I was easily labeled as too emotional, too angry, irrational for no reason. What happens in practice is what George Orwell already said. All animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. To conclude, neoliberal academia thrives on exclusionary inclusion. They want minority people to be seen, but they are not included in the decision-making, and they are not taken also seriously. Diversity becomes a checkbox, textual performance, as Sarah Ahmed says. White feminism centers binary gender, ignoring race, migration, and class. Complaints, especially about racism, are seen as attacks. It's too hard to touch. The person who speaks up becomes the problem. Silencing is systematic, not accidental. It pathologizes and dismisses complainants. Complaints are not resolved, they are managed, rather controlled. And lastly, I shared my story to challenge these extractive practices in knowledge production, to build solidarity beyond institutional limits, encourage intersectional approaches to diversity, and also to emphasize the personal is political. My experience is neither personal nor unique. There were voices in my head helped me to find my voice and to name. One of them being Toni Morrison once said, if there's a book you want to read, but it has not written yet, you have to write it. So my focus is forcibly now inclusion and exclusion in academia. A lot of people told me repeatedly, this is very common practice in academia, you should go your way, it happened to me, it's not a big deal, which is why I follow what Sarah Ahmed says. We have to keep saying it because they keep doing it. And last but not least, I carry with me the words of Said Reza, who, according to the legend, said these words. I could not deal with your lies and intrigues. That became my trouble, but I did not kneel before you, and let that be your trouble. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Faime, for your presentation and for sharing this personal experience and account of the topics that we are addressing and discussing in this webinar. We will move on to Sultan Turkan, our discussant for the day, who will give us some comments and some insights on the presented works and also the overarching themes of the webinar itself and the thematic issue. I remind everyone in the audience, if you have any questions or comments you want to address to any of the speakers, you are free to do so in the chat below. And without further ado, let's go to our last but not least presenter of the day, Dr. Sultan Turkan, Senior Lecturer in Bilingual Education at Queen's University in Belfast. Having been a migrant scholar from Turkey, she is previously a teacher, educator, and research scientist in the US, and her areas of research align with linguistically and culturally responsive teaching and assessments, educating teachers on migrant children, and teaching content to emerging bilinguals. So, Sultan, thank you so much for joining our contributors today, and we're eager to hear what you have to say.
So much for that introduction, Jose, and thank you so much to the speakers, Ulrike and colleague, for bringing all the beautiful papers together. I hope to do justice to the two papers that we have heard from in this discussion. Everyone can see my screen all right? Yes. Okay, perfect.
We can, yes.
Okay, wonderful. Really, I want to share some as inspirations and emerging themes that jumped at me as I looked at this issue, particularly the papers by Dr. Faime, Alpagu, and Dr. Anna Maria Isola. Unsilenced as an embodiment. Yes, I have this title. I came across this migration demonstration at a museum in Belfast, actually, in Faime's paper reminded me of this picture that I had taken a few years back. Because in her paper, she says, just because they give you a seat at the table does not to speak at the table, right? But the discussion is a call or is an invitation to nonetheless to bring a folding chair, even if we don't have a seat at the table, even when we are fully aware, we are fully cognizant, and all our senses say that they don't want us to speak at the table, but we still bring a folding chair because being unsilenced is an act of embodiment, and it's a full body experience. So these papers, as Ulrike introduced in the beginning, is really is a collection of papers focusing on imposition of institutional silencing, and there are all other types of silencing that we could think of, right? I mean, there is the focus on mobilization of power through silencing, but what jumped at me was from Anna Maria Isola's paper in relation to the distinction between silencing, being silent, and being silenced, right? And her insight around being silent and how that has served as a protective layer, as a protective shield, as actually ironically, as an agency of power, right? Someone has the power to be silent so they can protect themselves, right? And so these distinctions, and I come to this panel really not as a sociologist, but as an applied linguist, as a person who lives through languages and notices how languaging and walking, talking the language really shows up, all of those, how they show up in one's presence and discourse in a given context. So that really jumped to me as an interesting distinction. So I want to bring up some statements, questions, perhaps some discussion points for further reading, for further consideration among the participants in the audience. Faime tells us, Dr. Alpagu tells us the personal is political, and in her really in her brave sharing of her own story, her own experience, we understand how personal sharings in academic spaces can be weaponized against one, and how emotions, how body, how unplaced anger can show up, and how all of these things can become actually political, right? And it ties back to my title, how the personal is actually an embodiment, how the body itself is political, how our images in these workspaces, in any spaces, also as Dr. Ana Maria Isola examines in these substance abuse or mental health spaces, mental health hospital spaces, right? How body is political, because it indexes, again, looking at it through the linguistic lens that I do, how body indexes all kinds of images and language and perceptions and understandings of the world that become, in essence, a perpetuation of silencing or being silenced, and so on. The past is present, yes, and when we are recounting the past, in Dr. Faime Alpagu's experience, she had to anonymize her past experiences, and very eloquently she explained why she had to do that, right? And I just felt, because I wrote a similar autoethnography on experiences in the US of being marginalized in workspaces and so on. I just felt the agony of anonymizing. I felt how we are bounded by the norms of the academic discourse, right? And how that itself can be silencing and being silent and silenced. What this question jumps at me, right? The neoliberal systems we live and breathe through, right? What are the costs of neoliberal? It doesn't have to be university, right? Neoliberal structures, neoliberal mental health structures, neoliberal school structures, or what have you, that demand more competition for recognition and symbolic power under increasingly precarious working conditions. And how that then creates this idea of neoliberal good citizen, and that can come across in any space, in any place, in any context. And I know there are distinctions between these terms. And we learn from these papers, especially from Dr. Faime Alpagu's paper, that feminism is whiteness. I just felt inspired to say that. It's sort of bleached. It's colorblind, perhaps in some contexts, right? And group decisions and structures overpower the person and the person's story, and the person's story can only be mediated through coaching. But why not relationality? What happened to relationality? What happened to human agencies and human emotions, human relationships, right? How can we not bleach things, and how can we learn to actually relate to one another through struggles and not weaponize the struggles. Yes, and we learn that silence is both a survival mechanism and destructive, and it's also a destructive mechanism over generations of confrontation with assimilation and suppression. Through Dr. Anna Maria Isola's paper, right? And I find myself thinking about, with this next question applies to both papers, right? Who is the bystander? In Faime's paper, drawbridges, right? Who is the drawbridge? Who is the bystander in the perpetrator victim angle to form a triangle? And when that triangle is formed, how do we get at the truth with the capital T? Why would it matter to identify the bystander to get at the truth? Right? And how can we identify that bystander or that drawbridge, and so on? In reading Dr. Anna Maria Isola's paper, I ask a common question many people ask, right? Who writes the stories? Are we really the agents in writing our stories of exclusion, intergenerational suffering, marginalization, assimilation, and so on? What does it mean to be actors, reactors, and others in a story? And in our paradigm, in the paradigm that we choose to share these stories, why do we need to just stick to storytelling as a methodology to really evoke the emotions that we hope to convey, right? So linguistic landscapes also came to mind as I was really thinking about Dr. Faime Alpagu's paper and her autoethnography and so on. A workplace, and we can think about any place, any context, right? Why can we not think about these spaces as the nexus where the material and non-material, the linguistic, non-linguistic, the physical and metaphysical, the body and spirit, and all sorts of modes that define and derive human condition come together to form professional and personal identities. I bring this lens because intersectionality keeps being regurgitated. It keeps being said in the case of Dr. Faime Alpagu's paper, right? Intersectionality is emphasized in this group, but then that group really only then benefits a particular homogeneous group, a single minority group. It's the white female group that gets maybe represented, right? Instead, there are all these layers that get, in a sense, avoided and overlooked and dismissed. Racial linguistic lens, I take this lens often in my work, and it's relevant, and I bring this to this panel for consideration, obviously, and just for consideration, obviously, because I find it interesting to look at how, again, how the body is political, how ways of talking, how ways of writing, how some ways of talking and writing are capitalized over others, and how we can actually detect discrimination, detect marginalization through racial linguistic lenses. The good neoliberal citizen, as I mentioned earlier, that citizen that's hardworking, self-regulating, human abstraction, one that exists in a social vacuum, devoid of race, class, gender inequalities, and this especially comes up in Dr. Faime Alpagu's paper, right? Just the marginalized workers. In the case of Dr. Ana Maria Solar's marginalized patients, they are expected to take full responsibility, to be self-sufficient, and often gets blamed for not meeting the expectations to be a good citizen. And in the end, there is this concept of forever migrant, right? In any context that we may be talking about. And no matter what one does, no matter how many, as Dr. Faime Alpagu was saying, through the words of Baldwin, how much more the black body does than the white body, right? And there is always this sort of foreverness about being othered in a particular category. And to that, then I take refuge in the words of Dr. Maya Angelou. And some of you might think, oh, she brings Dr. Maya Angelou, how cliche. But I find in this quote the particular line where Dr. Angelou says, you must keep the place in you and that inviolate, that place, that pristine place, clean place, so that nobody has the right to curse you or treat you badly. Nobody, no mother, no father, no wife, no husband, nobody, because that might be the place we go to when we meet God. You have to have a place where you say back up, not anymore. Say no when it's no. Say so because that place has to remain clean and clear. When the person comes to you with rude language or invasive language, you have to be able to say, not me, you don't. I also find parallels in Dr. Mayangelo's words and Joseph Park's words and in paper on saying enough. And Joseph basically says it's a refusal to saying enough means it's refusing to enable particular patterns of participation in academic activity. Instead of saying I oppose you, we say your power has no authority over me. In this way, refusal is not so much a breaking of relations, but production of new ones, thus an act that is pregnant with transformative potential. So saying enough is actually also embodying this sensation that we are. So I leave those words, and I hope I did justice to the wonderful papers represented in this issue.
Thank you so much for your careful consideration of the papers that were presented, also for giving your more linguistic approach as well, giving us some inspiration as well at the end. I believe you did do justice to the task here. It seems like this was a very, very insightful conversation because our audience seems to not have any questions to pose to our speakers right now. I will take this time if anyone is shy and is just right now typing something in that all of the the entire issue and the papers that were presented are linked in the chat as well, so you can have a read at them whenever you want, and also the other papers that were not featured in this webinar are up there as well. I'll also give the chance to any of the speakers today if they want to give some final remarks, if they have some comments or questions they want to pose to Sultan or to each other, you are free to do so as well. If that is not the case, I want to thank all of you for joining us today. This was a really, really, really important conversation that we had today. Ulrike and Emily as well for putting this issue together. Faime and Ana Maria for taking the invite and presenting the research with us today. Sultan as well for accepting our invitation to join these contributions and giving such an insightful commentary on this whole thing. I just have some final remarks of my own to give. I want to thank the audience that joined us today. Some of them joined us also for the other two sessions that we had on our social inclusion journal. Ulrike, I see you. I'll give you the final speech. Let's say like that. I've linked as well a webinar that we are preparing as well for the next month about youth participation projects and initiatives, where we gathered from all our journals some examples of that. We'll also have a guest who's a youth activist herself giving us some commentary on that too. This webinar will be up on YouTube if you want to revisit this conversation or if you want to share it with a friend or a colleague who couldn't attend. All of the presentations will be shared with the attendees as well after this session. And I'll give Ulrike the chance to speak her mind as she.
Thanks so much. No, I wanted to again thanks the contributors, and the beauty of this webinar is really that you at least see some of the people who contributed, because otherwise you always do have that kind of email exchange, a name but not a face. So it's really, really nice to have face to the names. And particular thanks also to Sultan, my colleague at Queen's University, who really, as José already was saying, like brought some new ideas or different angles also from her discipline, and other reading or suggestions how we could also advance, let's say, our power or self-empowering possibilities to counter the silencing. And that's, I think, is really important. Yeah. Thanks so much. And of course, all who attended, even if you don't have questions. Thank you very much.
Truly. So again, thank you, Sultan, Faime, Anna Maria, and Ulrike for joining us. Thank you for all the attendees as well. And I hope to see you in the next one. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.